Hi class, we're on to the last system of the semester, the endocrine system. Now the endocrine system, you've seen little bits of it throughout the semester, and this is going to put everything hopefully together so you understand what the endocrine system is. First of all, you must know that the endocrine system works closely with the nervous system to maintain that all-important homeostasis. And we're going to compare the nervous system and the endocrine system too, just so you get it clear in your mind. Also, by now you should know the difference between an endocrine versus exocrine gland. Remember, crine, C-R-I-N-E, means secretion. So both exocrine and endocrine glands secrete something. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the blood. They are ductless. They secrete their hormones into the blood. Exocrine glands have ducts, and that's where they secrete their secretions into ducts. We say endocrine glands or endocrine cells release hormones into the blood. What are hormones? Hormones are chemical messengers. You've heard that term before when we talked about neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters being chemical messengers. These are chemical messengers also. These chemical messengers, aka hormones, travel in the blood to reach their target organs, their target cells. What are target organs and target cells? When we say a hormone has a specific target organ or target cell, it means that those target cells have to have a receptor to that specific hormone in order for that cell to have a response to that specific hormone. A hormone can only interact with a target cell that has a receptor to it. Very, very important that you understand that. Here is just a simple drawing showing you that endocrine cell that is making its hormone, releasing the hormone into the blood where it is carried throughout the body to its target cells. These cells must have a receptor for that specific hormone to have some kind of action that's going to take place. So, simple concept, just remember that. So we're going to briefly go over this chart, which is kind of important to understand, comparing the endocrine and the nervous system. We talked about the nervous system. They release their chemical transmitter is a neurotransmitter that causes a nerve impulse action potential between the neuron and its target cell. We're using those same kind of words when we talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system releases its chemical messenger, the hormone, into the blood, and hormones are going to their target cells throughout the body. Where does a neuron release its neurotransmitter? Remember, other neurons, muscle cells, skeletal smooth cardiac, and glands. That you should remember always. Hormones, they're going to react with any cell in the body that has a receptor for that hormone. The response time in the nervous system is milliseconds. It's usually milliseconds. Action potential, release of neurotransmitters, you have a response. With the endocrine system, the response time to those hormones is going to be longer. It's usually going to be minutes to hours to have a response time, much slower response time. The effects of the stimulation from the nervous system, you probably remember this: contraction of muscles, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, and secretion from all types of glands, endocrine and exocrine glands. The effects of the stimulation of a hormone on its target cells, it is going to be varied. It is going to be a little more complex. It is going to be changing the metabolic activity in those target cells. We'll skip down to the duration of response in the nervous system. It is fast, short, terminated quickly, it's over. Whereas the duration of response with hormones is going to be, it can be long lasting. It's usually going to be days to weeks, even months, continuing after the stimulus, that hormone, is removed. So just a quick comparison, make sure you understand how these are alike but different in the way they react with their chemical messengers and their target cells. When you look at the functions of the endocrine system and you just read through these functions: regulation of the internal environment, metabolism and energy balance, cardiac and smooth muscle contraction, regulation of the immune system, regulation of glandular secretions. That sounds much like the functions of the nervous system also. Maintenance of homeostasis, growth and development and reproduction. Also, much like the nervous system. A lot of this is autonomic nervous system. So just to reinforce that concept that the endocrine system is working closely with your nervous system. So the endocrine system consists of endocrine glands that secrete hormones and endocrine cells that secrete hormones. When you talk about pure endocrine glands, they are referring to the only function of these glands is to make and secrete hormones. That is their job. They have no secondary job. The pure endocrine glands in your body are going to be the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, you've seen it before. This is in that little sella turcica that you learned so long ago in the sphenoid bone. We are going to be talking about the pituitary gland at length and all the hormones it secretes. Another pure endocrine gland is the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland sits right below the thyroid cartilage in the neck. So thyroid gland, a pure endocrine gland. And then you're going to have this gland, the parathyroid gland. This parathyroid gland is behind the thyroid gland. Para means around. Around what? The thyroid gland. These parathyroid glands, there are these tiny little dots. These are making parathyroid hormone. These are tiny little guys. These are on the backside of the thyroid gland. Itty bitty. These are itty bitty. The next pure endocrine gland are the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands, you've seen adrenal glands before. They sit on top of the kidneys. And then, of course, the pineal gland that you learned when we were doing the nervous system. The pineal gland up in the diencephalon, it is making the hormone melatonin. Those are your pure endocrine glands. When we talk about other organs that contain endocrine cells, it means these organs have another job other than just making hormones. The pancreas. We talked about the pancreas. The pancreas it's both an endocrine and an exocrine gland, so we'll be talking about the hormones of the pancreas again, glucagon and insulin, but it also is an exocrine gland. The hypothalamus, we'll talk about that at length. The hypothalamus actually makes hormones in addition to all its other jobs that it has in the nervous system. The gonads, obviously the gonads in the male, testes, and the ovaries in the female, they make their own sex hormones, but they have other functions than making sex hormones. In the stomach, you learned a hormone released by the G cells in the stomach, the gastric pit. Gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone. And in the kidneys, you learned what hormone. You've seen it like 3 times now. Erythropoietin. So just get those straight, which ones are pure endocrine glands and which ones contain endocrine cells, but that is not their main job. They have other functions other than making hormones. This video is only going to be focusing on the pituitary gland. That little itty bitty pea-sized shaped gland that sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. It weighs 0.02 ounces, but it controls so much. This is your master endocrine gland. So we will spend a lot of time just on this one gland in this video. When you look at the pituitary gland, you're going to see these 2 little sacs. And they are totally different in the way they are making and storing their hormones. Made of different kind of tissue also. We're going to have the anterior pituitary gland that sits in the front. It is the bigger one. And then we're going to have the posterior pituitary gland in the backside. There is this word, hypothesis. They being the people that named all this stuff, are going to be calling the pituitary gland, aka hypothesis. So when you see that word, that hypothesis, it is referring to the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is called the Adeno Hypothesis. So they are just putting this term, adeno, in front of hypothesis. What does adeno mean? It has to do with this is glandular tissue. It is epithelial tissue, glandular tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue makes up our glands. Then we have the posterior pituitary gland, aka neurohypophysis. They're putting neuro in front of hypophysis because the posterior pituitary gland is not glandular tissue, it is nervous tissue. Totally different than the anterior pituitary gland. So we're going to look at those closer. So let's have a quick look at the difference between the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. Let's start with the posterior pituitary gland, the neurohypophysis. We said neuro means this is all nervous tissue. This is all nervous tissue. So what we have here, number one, you need to know that the hypothalamus is basically in charge of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, we have our neurons up in the hypothalamus that are actually making the hormones that are going to be released from the posterior pituitary gland. They are making the hormones. They are sending those hormones down their axons into their axon terminals, where they are storing them. Just like in the nervous system where we have axon terminals that are storing our neurotransmitters, same thing. They are storing their chemical messengers, which are their hormones. So, in the hypothalamus, the neurons make their own hormones. They are sending it down their axons, storing it in their axon terminals, and then when this cell is activated, it's going to send an action potential and have the hormones released from the axon terminals, and those hormones, those chemical messengers, will then be sent out into the blood and go to their target organs. There are only 2 posterior pituitary gland hormones that you need to know: oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and we'll look at those closer. But those are the 2 posterior pituitary gland hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So, posterior pituitary gland, all nervous tissue. Then we get to the larger anterior pituitary gland, the Adeno hypothesis. Adeno, again, means glandular. So what's happening here, we still have, up in the hypothalamus, we have our neurons that are actually making hormones. They are making hormones. These are called releasing hormones. When they release their hormones, like any hormone is going to be released into a blood vessel. So these hypothalamus releasing hormones will be released into a blood vessel that is carried directly to their target cells. Now there's going to be a lot of different releasing hormones because there's a lot of different target cells, because there's a lot of different hormones down in the anterior pituitary gland that are made by their respective target cells. So here we have a releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, sent into the blood directly to their target cells, and their target cells will release their respective hormones into the blood, where their hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland will be sent to their target organs. Hopefully that makes sense. So I just want to go over the hormones you're going to be learning in this lecture video. In the posterior pituitary gland, the neurohypothesis, remember this is all nervous tissue. The 2 hormones that are going to be released are the antidiuretic hormone. Its target is going to be the collecting ducts in the kidney. We went over this when we were doing the kidney. And oxytocin. Oxytocin, its target organs are going to be the smooth muscle of the uterus, the myometrium, and the mammary glands in the breast. So we're going to be looking at these more closely, but those are the 2 hormones from the posterior pituitary gland. In the anterior pituitary gland, we're going to be looking at, I think, just 6. We're only going to be looking at 6 anterior pituitary gland hormones. There are a couple of more, but we're going to be concentrating on these 6 big ones. Growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, gonadotropin hormones, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. So we'll look at each of these hormones more closely also. So let's concentrate just on the posterior pituitary gland, aka the neurohypothesis. Once again, those two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary gland are going to be antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Who produces these hormones? The neurons up in the hypothalamus. They are produced by these neurons up in the hypothalamus. There's special type of neurons. They call them neurosecretory cells, but they're basically neurons. They make those hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, send them down their axons where they are going to be stored in axon terminals. Those axon terminals are within the posterior pituitary gland. When they are activated, they will get an action potential. Those axon terminals will then release their respective hormones into the blood. Oxytocin is going to go to the smooth muscles of the uterus and the smooth muscles of the mammary glands. Antidiuretic hormone, aka vasopressin, you'll see that term also. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, is going to go to the kidney tubules. Those are the target organs. So let's look at those two hormones. The first one is going to be oxytocin. Remember, this is released from the posterior pituitary gland, goes straight into the blood to its target organs. Its target organs are going to be the smooth muscle of the uterus, that myometrium. When the baby is about ready to be delivered, that head is going to be pushing on the cervix. The head of the baby pushes against the cervix. That impulse from the cervix is sent to the brain. Your brain stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin is carried to the bloodstream and its target organ, the myometrium, and it stimulates uterine contractions. And it pushes the baby further and further down and out during labor. Now, some of you may have heard of this term, Pitocin. Pitocin is a synthetic oxytocin. If you need to start labor for some reason, you are post-dates, you are now 42 weeks, and your baby's getting too big, they will induce labor. And they can induce labor with synthetic oxytocin, Pitocin. So that's in the uterus smooth muscle, the myometrium. There is also oxytocin is going to work on the smooth muscles of the mammary glands. So what happens when the baby does start suckling after delivery? That impulse, that suckling impulse, is going to be carried to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will sense it and release oxytocin to squeeze out the milk that is being produced. There's smooth muscles in these mammary glands, and they're going to squeeze. And if you've ever breastfed, you know that feeling of a letdown when the milk is being squished out. That is from oxytocin also. And you may also note when you just delivered early on, when you get suckling, you're going to feel uterine contraction also, which is going to be tightening up that uterus to hopefully its pre-pregnant uterus size by that stimulation of the oxytocin just from the baby suckling. Kinda cool there. And the other posterior pituitary gland hormone is antidiuretic hormone. You should already know this because we learned it when we were doing the urinary system. When you are dry, Your body senses that you are dry. Your plasma osmolarity increases, which means you don't have enough free water. It's going to, your hypothalamus will trigger the release of ADH. Antidiuretic hormone is released. Its target organ is on the collecting ducts of the kidney, and it's going to cause a reabsorption of water back into your blood vessels. Antidiuretic, anti-P hormone. It's going to reabsorb as much water as it can back into your blood vessels. That's just a review for you guys. So by now you know the posterior pituitary gland. Pretty simple. The Adeno Hypothesis makes sense. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone. Now we're going to the larger anterior pituitary gland, aka the Adeno Hypothesis. Remember, the posterior pituitary gland does not synthesize hormones. It merely stores them. Who synthesizes the hormones in the posterior pituitary gland? We're in the hypothalamus. They are neurons in the hypothalamus that synthesize the hormones in the posterior pituitary gland. In the anterior pituitary gland, it does manufacture hormones. But the secretion of all the hormones in the anterior pituitary gland is regulated by hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. Remember, we call those releasing hormones. The anterior pituitary gland makes and stores its hormones, but they are only released when the hypothalamus says so. Basically, the hypothalamus is in charge of the pituitary gland. So let's look at these anterior pituitary gland hormones. There are 6 anterior pituitary hormones that you need to know. These are the 6 biggies. TSH, that stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. ACTH, that stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. And we're going to look at each of these separately. 3, LH, luteinizing hormone. 4, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. 5, growth hormone. 6, prolactin. So let's look at each of those individually. Before we look at each of these individual hormones, I just want you to understand that the hypothalamus is making these releasing hormones. So these releasing hormones are going to be sent down through blood vessels that are in the infundibulum, and then their target organ is going to be those cells in the anterior pituitary gland. Just to reinforce that concept, releasing hormones from the hypothalamus sent through blood vessels straight to their target cells in the anterior pituitary gland that are going to be releasing their own individual type of hormones. These are the 6 hormones we're going to be talking about. The first anterior pituitary hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So TSH is released from the anterior pituitary gland. Its target organ is the thyroid gland. Pretty simple. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Its target organ is the thyroid gland. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland to release its thyroid hormones. the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Pretty simple. Here is the thyroid gland on your model in the classroom, right underneath the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. The thyroid gland. So this is your thyroid gland. And we'll talk about the thyroid hormones in another video when we talk about the thyroid gland specifically and its hormones. Right now, we're just talking about the anterior pituitary hormone, TSH. Its target organ is the thyroid gland, which then will release thyroid hormone. The second hormone from the anterior pituitary gland is ACTH. Know what that stands for? Adrenocorticotrophic hormone. This is going to the adrenal gland, the cortex of the adrenal gland. You've seen the adrenal gland before when we're talking about the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. There are two parts to the adrenal gland. The adrenal cortex. Remember, if an organ has a cortex, the cortex is always the outside of the organ. And the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenal gland. This hormone, ACTH, is only going to the adrenal cortex, and it is going to cause the release of adrenal cortex hormones, which are all corticosteroid hormones. And we'll talk about those types of hormones later when we talk about the adrenal gland specifically. But for now, know that ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland is causing the release of these adrenal cortex hormones. They are cortico meaning the cortex, steroid hormones. They are steroids. A different type of hormone that we've seen. These are steroid hormones. Remember, the adrenal medulla, it's going to be releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine, but that is coming from the control of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The next two hormones that we're going to talk about from the anterior pituitary gland is LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. You briefly saw these in the reproductive system. Their target organs are the gonads. Testes in males, ovaries in females. The action of these hormones is to stimulate the maturation of the sex cells, either sperm or the egg, release of an egg in the female, and induce secretion of sex hormones from the testes, which would be testosterone and other androgens, and then the ovaries, we would have estrogen and progesterone. So remember, LH and FSH, those are going to the gonads. This chart, you briefly saw it in the reproductive system. I just want to show you how these hormones, FSH and LH, are so important for proper ovulation and your menses. LH and FSH are released. There's going to be this huge spike in luteinizing hormone that is going to trigger ovulation. That seems to be a big question that I see in TEAS exams is what hormone triggers ovulation? No, that is the luteinizing hormone. And you're going to see estrogen and progesterone are going up also from the gonads, well, here the ovaries, and we're going to get a drop in estrogen and a drop in progesterone, and then we're going to have our menses. So very important for FSH and LH very important in the female for proper ovulation and their menses cycle. Our fifth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, growth hormone. Now the growth hormone is going to be targeting a wide range of cells that have to do with growth. Basically muscle, bone, cartilage, and liver. Their actions are wide. Promotes the growth of body tissue. That is how you are growing. Now, growth hormone is one of those hormones that if you have problems with it, it's going to affect you. If you have hypersecretion of growth hormone as a child, you are going to be growing exponentially. At age 8, this gentleman, Robert Wadlow, who's the tallest recorded human in history, 8 feet 11 inches, basically 9 feet tall. When he was 8 years old, he was 6 feet 2 inches tall. Huge. This is his family. His family, no problems. His mom and dad, his sibs, but he had a hypersecretion of growth hormone. He died at age 22 years old at a weight of 492 pounds. He died of an actual infection of his foot. There's a lot of weight put down on his joints and his feet. He had to wear braces to help support his joints because he was so tall. Now, if you have hypersecretion of growth hormone in adults after you finished originally growing and your bones are no longer growing, this is the effect that prolonged growth hormone can have on adults. It's called acromegaly. You can see here's this person at age 16, looks pretty normal, still getting stimulation. The bones are growing, but they're not growing in a normal fashion. They're just getting bigger and wider. And this is her at 52. Total difference of appearance with growth hormone as an adult. That is called acromegaly. Here's a more recent patient that was studied. The growth hormone wasn't severe, wasn't hypersecreted in a hugely, is that even a word, hugely? But you can see from 1977 to 1988, you can see this gradual change in her facial features. This is acromegaly, hypersecretion of growth hormone. If you have hyposecretion of growth hormone, you can get this type of dwarfism. It's called pituitary dwarfism. These are some famous actors that have had pituitary dwarfism. And then this series, The Little People of the Big World, these people have also pituitary dwarfism. Now, our last hormone, yay, of the anterior pituitary gland is prolactin hormone. So prolactin, that is telling you it's making lactation. It's making milk. It's a making milk hormone. Now prolactin and oxytocin work together. Remember, oxytocin is working on the mammary glands also. It's ejecting that milk, squirting that milk out with that letdown, the milk ejection, and prolactin is actually making the milk in those mammary glands. So this is just showing you suckling signals the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to release oxytocin to eject the milk and release prolactin to induce lactation, the milk production. Here is our final review slide. This is the last slide of this lecture. Remember, the posterior pituitary gland, the Adeno Hypothesis. This is all nervous tissue. It makes two hormones. Well, the posterior pituitary gland doesn't make these two hormones. The hypothalamus makes these two hormones, but they are stored in the terminal axons. And when they're called to be released, they're going to release antidiuretic hormone. Its action is on the collecting ducts of the kidney, and oxytocin, which is stimulating the smooth muscle of the uterus and the smooth muscles within the mammary glands to get milk ejection. The anterior pituitary gland, the Adeno Hypothesis, has 6 hormones you need to know: growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH, which is going to the adrenal cortex, FSH and LH going to the gonads, testes and ovaries, and prolactin, which is going to milk the mammary glands to make milk. One other thing I want to bring up is hormones. There's 2 classes of hormones. There are going to be amino acid protein-based hormones and steroid-based hormones. All the hormones from the posterior and anterior pituitary gland, these are all protein amino acid based hormones. And anytime you see any hormone that ends with IN, you know it's going to be a protein amino based hormone. Might be important on some exams, I'm not sure. So oxytocin, prolactin, they end in IN. You will see other hormones that might have an end in IN, like melatonin that you've already learned, erythropoietin. Those are all amino acid protein-based hormones. So all these hormones from the pituitary gland are protein-based. When you get to steroid-based hormones, the ones you're going to need to know are going to be the hormones released from the adrenal cortex. Cortical hormones. These are steroid hormones. The ones released from the testes, testosterone, and any androgens. These are steroid-based hormones. The ones released from the ovary, estrogen and progesterone. These are also steroid-based hormones. But as far as for you, everything released from the pituitary gland is a protein amino acid based hormone. Just wanted to bring that in. So that's it for this video. The next video will cover the rest of the endocrine glands and some organs that have endocrine cells.